Okay, I think we've got a series of good questions, and we see some that have some overlaps. I'm going to try to do our best to address everyone's interests and sort of get a good discussion going here. So I think the first question, the one that by far has the most votes here, is what role, and this is probably targeted towards FAA, but I would love to hear everyone's input, is what role does or should the commercial spaceflight industry have in self-regulation? So Dr. Nield, we can start with you.
So the operators have responsibility to be mature, professional, and look out for this common resource that we have. And that's especially true without any existing regulations. If you take a very short-term, selfish view, then that can be to the detriment of the rest of the community. And just a simple example, I've heard people say, oh, well, people that have these large communication satellites, it's in their own interest to make sure that things don't crash into each other, and so it's going to work out fine. Okay, but how about the university, the high school, the elementary school? There are elementary schools now that are building CubeSats, and they're launching that. And I don't ascribe to them any inappropriate or evil intent, but they just are not aware of all of the potential implications of having that object in orbit, which can act like a piece of space junk and crash into the International Space Station or other very valuable assets. So I think it's in all of our interests to act responsibly. My view is that with the proper kind of regulatory framework from the government, and to some extent internationally too, we can strike the right balance that still is going to allow access to space, but do so in a way that allows us all to continue to use space in the future.
Any of the other panelists want to comment on that one? Role of industry?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, from my perspective, I agree with everything that Dr. Nield said, and I think, you know, the more transparent that you make the sharing of data and information when it comes to this idea of to what extent, you know, can non-government kind of self-regulate, I think, again, in that transparency, there is a sort of checks and balances, but at the same time, like Dr. Nield said, there is a role for government to make sure that there's equity. And so, again, like I said in my own talk, complete self-regulation, there are examples that I know of that demonstrate that that would not work so well, but certainly there has to be some element of that because, again, it is in people's best interest to be safe. So some mixture, I think something hybrid makes sense for sure.
Okay. So I think there's been a lot of discussion about transfer of space traffic management or space situational awareness from being a military function to a civil function. I'd like to get your feedback on how you see the transfer of that responsibility from what has been traditionally a military function for tracking space objects to how it would work to transfer some of that control to a civilian agency. I think General Brown.
Well, I agree with your remarks earlier where you talked about a crawl, walk, run approach, and I certainly think that that we would need to do that. I also agree, I think, with the pilot program that you suggested, where we demonstrate this, you know, together, because I think, you know, I would say DoD is not against this at all, but we want to make sure that we maintain our ability to defend and attribute, I would say, bad actors in space, and because that's critical, I think, for our nation's defense as well as to our allies. So a partnership in this endeavor, I think, is certainly the way to go. And I think, as you suggested, I think there's the authorities, the resources that are still out there that the FAA would need in order to do this. And so I do think it'll take us time to do it, but I think it's something that makes sense.
Just a few other comments. As I mentioned in my remarks, the military has done an amazing job of keeping track of all those objects over the decades. They did not seek out that role, but they were the only ones who were capable of fulfilling that responsibility, at least up to this point. And as many of you know, the sensors that we have and the software that we put in place was basically originally intended to defend against incoming ICBMs. And we have adapted that to the current situation. And so today, everybody's got their head down and they're doing the job because they have the responsibility to alert folks when there's a potential collision coming up. And that is appropriate. If and when we get to the point where there's another way that the commercial operators, the international operators, the civil operators can be provided with the information they need, then the military can focus on the national security mission. And I think that's what they want, and that's in all of our best interests.
Okay. Dr. Jha, were you interested in discussing that from the perspective of data so one of the questions I'm interested in is with respect to, traditionally we have a national architecture that supports space situational awareness, and we're seeing a kind of onslaught of commercial providers coming in offering data. I think from your role's perspective, Dr. Jha, how would you see the validation of that data and taking in commercial data and combining it with government data? How would you envision that
Right.
could work?
So I definitely think there are several tiers of data that should be used. For sure, the Space Surveillance Network goes through rigorous processes for validating and trusting these things, and so that's great. Now you understand those, you put those aside. Next tier can be things that people bring to the table, and by the way, by being able to do these sorts of combinatorics that I spoke about earlier in the sense of the statistical consistency and that sort of thing, the more data you have, the easier it is to see the things that you might not want to trust. And so the DARPA Orbit Outlook program has taken some great steps in that direction, and I think it's going to be a demonstrator of what that looks like, because specifically it's looking at how to bring in Jimmy's backyard telescope and somebody who has binoculars that report something re-entering. How would you even take that in and capitalize on that? You have the non-traditional data pre-processing program that SMC has funded to find ways to map things from other people's formats into formats that can be processed. So I think the government, the DoD, is making good steps in that direction. And certainly I think that there's a lot of utility to being able to ingest any source of data. And again, but it takes lots of data to start sifting out what's good and what isn't. So the more we have, the easier it'll be to be able to do that.
Okay. So, Dr. Nield, given the range of new responsibilities that are being discussed or proposed for FAA, there was a series of questions around how is FAA going to address the increased needs for your organization, both from a staffing standpoint and from evaluation of technically complex subjects that may be beyond the things that traditionally FAA has reviewed. Is there already a plan in place for how FAA would expand to address that, or can you speak a little bit to that?
Clearly, we would need the help of Congress to get the resources we need to take on this job. We certainly would not want to take on the new responsibilities without the resources to do it and to do it right. But there's a process to handle that. We have done our own internal benchmarking in terms of how many folks and what kinds of resources and what kind of software and equipment does the DoD need to do the job that it's doing today, which, by the way, is much bigger than the job we're talking about for safety. And we've done some internal projections in terms of what those requirements would be. But if and when the FAA were tasked with taking on this new responsibility, then of course we would do the normal budget request review process to vet it through the government and make sure that we're not missing anything and that we're providing an accurate projection on what the implications of this are. It can't be done for free, but in fairness, based on the many years of learning and operations that the military has successfully accomplished, and by taking advantage of the advanced technologies and the new capabilities that are out there today in the private sector, I think we can start with a clean sheet that does not require a huge amount of resources to accomplish. And of course, at the same time, we would want to continue to work very closely with the DoD to share the data in both directions so that we all can have the best possible results from our work.
Okay. Next question is for any of the panelists. So the question is, whose responsibility is removal of space debris, and what should we do about addressing that? It's not an easy question by any stretch, but opinions on it. We can start with that, General Brown. If you're willing.
That is a tough problem, because we're always mindful, certainly at Stratcom and in my previous job as a director for test at the Missile Defense Agency, to make sure anything that we were doing in space did not result in debris. I'm not sure, because I certainly I think it's everyone's responsibility, but I think what we're trying to do with some of our satellites, and we have a lot for DoD, a lot of aging satellites that we try to ensure don't contribute to what that 16 second or whatever it was, that video that we showed. We showed that to 60 Minutes when they did a filming recently at Stratcom as well as CNN to show what's really happening in space, because nobody gets it, I don't think, unless you're a part of this community. I think what we try to do is make sure that when it's time for one of our satellites to be decommissioned, that we are using the safest and most not sure what the word I'm searching for, but the best means for us to get whatever that is out of orbit so that it doesn't cause debris. But I'll leave it to the experts on what they think.
So a really complex issue. You might think that whoever puts something up should be responsible for taking it down, but that is made more difficult by a couple of things. First, the whole legal international policy questions about who's going to make me do it, and what if you don't have the technical capability. There's been a lot of analysis done on, at some point, if we get so much congestion that we're having regular collisions, then even if we stop putting things in orbit, then collisions are going to continue, which makes more pieces, which makes more collisions. And there's some debate on whether we might be either at that point or rapidly approaching that point in the near future. So that is something we need to think about and plan for. If you want to be visionary, you can say, well, maybe there is something we can do in a proactive way to actually somehow incentivize countries, companies, other groups to figure out a way to take at least a few of the larger pieces out, and that may make enough of a difference such that we don't have this continued exponential growth in orbital debris. Those are some of the challenges that people are looking at, whether you can easily deorbit things, whether you can go up and capture things or give them a delta V that will cause them to re-enter and so forth. But the technology is not really there right now to do that in an economic way. And the other challenge is a lot of the things that you might do to accomplish that could be interpreted as hostile actions by other nations. And so it's a very complex issue, but one we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I guess my quick thoughts is that it requires international collaboration. It's not any single country or entity has a responsibility of doing that. I think, again, trying to really monitor all these things and really quantify what the risk is of these things still remaining on orbit. I mean, we know that it's kind of analogous to having a very wide, if you look at the two-line elements in the catalog and you plot these things, you're going to see that space isn't uniformly populated. There are groupings, there's clusters. And each one of these clusters could be viewed as a very wide lane highway. But when things stop working, that's like a car without a driver, just adrift. So how many of those do we want to have in the future? And so that's one of the questions that we need to ask. And what's the risk of having cars adrift without drivers long term? And I think if we can start couching things that way, and again, seek things at the international level, maybe UN COPIUS or other mechanisms to just at least have these discussions, I think the world rallies around together and does good things when things make sense and things are articulated properly and they're transparent and that sort of thing.
Along those lines of international engagement, so we talked a little bit about a U.S. approach to a regulatory framework for mission authorization, but that's fine for the U.S. Space doesn't really care where international boundaries are. So the question would be, how do we coordinate with international entities, other countries, to provide a overall regulatory framework to everyone's benefit? What are ways that you see that we engage international partners?
So the military is already working with many other countries to share data, and so there are a number of agreements that have been put in place, and that's a great thing. But I think to try to look at a regulatory environment, again, that can be challenging. The United Nations does some great things, but it tends to take a long time to get anything accomplished. And it's just a question of trying to get so many people around the table and decide something. The more people we have, the more difficult that process can be. Our approach has been to try to be open, transparent, to talk about what we think the problems are and what we think the potential solutions are, and to do that both on a bilateral basis and in international forum and conferences and so forth. But to really focus on what can we in the United States do that we have control over and that we have a reasonable shot at accomplishing. And then as we try that out, if it looks like it's working, then we can invite other partner nations to come along. Let's do it the same way. Let's join together. Let's combine our data. Let's have similar regulatory frameworks. And that can be an example of an opportunity for the United States to exercise its leadership in space, but by doing so in a way that shows that we know what we're talking about and we are taking care of our own challenges, and we invite the rest of the world to join us in that.
A broader question that I think was everyone just kind of seeking guidance for our next generation. What recommendations would you give parents or educators to better prepare our next generation for the changes that we see coming and the things that are happening in space? So, John Brown, we'll start with you.
So Stratcom has a great relationship with academia, and we continue to grow that. I think that we need to continue to emphasize STEM, and that boys and girls, it is our future. Whether it's space, whether it's our nuclear force, regardless of what we're talking about, if we need to grow these next generations by continuing to emphasize science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and that would be my advice to parents and educators.
That's certainly good advice. I think we could also recognize that how we tell the story can make a difference. I know many people growing up want to be able to help others, and when you talk about, you need to take this calculus class first, then you need to take your double E and so forth, without the vision of here's what you're going to be able to do when you complete this course of study. Here's the kind of projects you can solve. Here's the kind of challenges you can meet. That can get people excited. And I was down in Guadalajara as well, and I was struck by the young people from all around the world that somehow were inspired by some of the visionary things that were being said by the speakers there. And it wasn't just because it was all technical and you got to go study engineering. It was, hey, this is a vision for our future, and you can be a part of it. Pat Hines mentioned the importance of inclusion and the things that are planned for later on this week to try to help that to occur. We need more than just the mathematicians and the engineers. We need the lawyers. We need the policy people. We need all kinds of folks to make this space economy successful.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, along with what was previously said, a couple of things. Thing number one, I think, unfortunately, many countries do this, but certainly the United States, we focus too much on grades instead of learning. And I think that that's something that needs to change in the educational system. I tell my kids, yeah, the good grades is something, certainly it makes me happy to see that, but there are many people that I went to school with that they just crammed to get good grades on homeworks and tests, and then they get their degree, and then it's like, well, can you solve this problem? I have no idea. But you have a 4.0 GPA. Well, but I forgot this, that, or the other. So how useful was that? So I think we need to focus more on learning than just getting good grades. I think the other thing too, it's hard. Like sometimes I forget how hard it is until I try to take time out of my own life to go and talk to people at grade schools and that sort of stuff. It's extremely rewarding, but it means that there's something else I'm not doing. But the thing is, this is the thing that we are called to do. I see many people already in their careers, industry, what have you, and say, oh, well, we have this absence of people that are doing STEM. When's the last time you went to a school and talked to somebody or did this, that, or the other? It's not just going to happen on its own. It needs community involvement, and all of us need to get in there and do it. And I think the last thing is, how do we incentivize people to better go in these careers? I can tell you that when people go to college, they say, the student loan debt alone and the burden and this, that, or the other, and really I got to do that much school to be able to, if all of a sudden you made it very attractive where maybe there's certain career paths that wouldn't incur so much debt and that sort of stuff to try to bring people in, I think that could also work as an incentive.
Interesting. So a broader question as we start to look beyond just space, but we're looking at near space and suborbital flight. How is U.S. view and maintain our national sovereignty when we are looking at, without defining a limit between what is space and what is suborbital flight, and how do we address some of these new concepts that are looking at things like balloons and suborbital launches that are seeking out new things? So we could start with General Brown.
Start with him.
Okay, we'll start. Sorry about you're closest to me, so it's my natural
I know.
inclination. Sorry.
That's one of the things
one.
that is really exciting and challenging and stimulating to me as I work in the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, because there is no bookshelf behind me that says, oh yeah, let's see how to work that problem. Oh yeah, page 17, number 3. Okay, we'll do that. We're having to come up with new ways of doing things. We're having to deal with new and different ideas from industry on how to launch satellites and how to operate, and it's great. So as a regulator, we need to be open to that. We need to be willing to confess that we don't have all the answers, and that we're all ears, and we're interested in what your thoughts are on how to solve this particular issue. When we talk about suborbital flights from the policy perspective, that's pretty straightforward in terms of normally it goes up and then comes back and lands at the same location. But you can see just over the horizon is what happens when it's point A to point B. And that's the holy grail of really something that's going to revolutionize global transportation.
Suborbital transport.
And how do you do that? Whose license applies? And how do you know that that's a legitimate launch instead of a hostile one? And do you have to have 2 sets of regulatory frameworks and all those kinds of things? So we're trying to address those things from our perspective right now in talking with other nations, telling them, here's how we write our regulations, here's how we do our license, and oh, by the way, we have informed consent and things like that, rather than just assuming we're going to certify these vehicle-like aircraft, which sounds like a good idea, but it makes it a lot harder. If we're talking about that in the international community, then hopefully we'll be prepared when the technology is going to enable us to do some of that high-speed point-to-point transportation.
So General Brown, one I think that you are more familiar with, so you talked a little bit about the JICSPOC as a new thing that's being stood up, and we talked a lot about the JSPOC and what, and then even some of the transfer responsibility potential to FAA. Can you talk a little bit about the difference you see in those roles and responsibilities between those
Sure.
organizations?
So I did talk about the JICSPOC and the JSPOC in my remarks, but kind of simply put, I think General Hyten, during his recent congressional testimony, said it best. the JSPOC, and that's where we do the cataloging and the notification for collision avoidance. The JSPOC is and will continue to be supporting the terrestrial layer. And what it does is it supports a warfighter on the ground. The JICSPOC in Colorado is currently being used for experimentation, and the plan is for a conflict that would extend into space. We're going to use the JICSPOC to enable that capability for us. So it doesn't even come into full capability or initial capability until 2018. We're still doing experiments right now, but so that's really working at defending our assets that are in space and a warfight that would extend into space.
Okay. So I think one question we'd like to ask everyone, so with a kind of new space revolution happening and all the new concepts that are coming in from different commercial providers, what do you think is the most interesting or transformative commercial thing that you've seen to affect your interests or your agency's mission? Whoever wants to start.
So two things. I believe reusability is going to be the key that really unlocks greater access to space at affordable costs. And so the things that we're seeing from Blue Origin and SpaceX and potential reuse from United Launch Alliance and other providers really will make a difference in the long term. But in terms of being something that changes our paradigm, I'm personally excited about the whole suborbital space tourism thing, because I think that is going to be the new market that is going to really accelerate the progress we're going to be able to make in space. Because instead of having 5 or 6 space shuttle launches per year, when we have multiple operators launching space tourists on suborbital space flights, it won't be long before those are flying once a week, once a day, multiple times per day. Now, think about that for a minute. You have several flights per day, add those up, you're going to have hundreds of launches per year with thousands of people getting to experience space flight for themselves. That's going to be a real change in how we think about space. And I believe we're going to learn a lot of lessons from that suborbital commercial endeavor that is going to pay off for government users and for orbital transportation as well, because we're going to get so many more data points. We're going to have so much more experience on what works, what doesn't, what's a better way to make it safer, more reliable, more cost-effective. We can translate a lot of those same lessons into more challenging missions, including space exploration itself.
Dr. John?
Yeah, so from my perspective, along with what Dr. Nield said, is just the plethora of information. I mean, much like with social media, all of a sudden that opened the doors to understanding what's going on the ground in many countries. 10 years ago when I was just getting into AFRL, if you would have asked me, do you think that SSA would be so dominated by the private sector at this point? And I'd say no. The plethora of data from people that have backyard telescopes and even some on-orbit assets from other countries bring to the table, and people that are really focused on imagery and trying to tie that to human-based activity, is going to be like information overload on tap kind of thing. And I think that's the big paradigm shift, is the things that we're going to be able to discover and know about the place where we live and what's going on in space is completely changing given the wealth of information content that currently exists to be mined. And it looks like we have an uber data problem. Not just a big data problem, but hyper data problem, and that's one of the things that we need to manage.
When I got to Stratcom in February of 15, we had just started this Joint Space Doctrine and Tactics Forum that's really taken off. It's co-chaired by Admiral Haney and Betty Sapp, Ms. Sapp from the National Reconnaissance Office. Back then, I could go days without talking about space. I couldn't go a single day without talking about our nuclear deterrent force. I can't go a day without talking about space at Stratcom. I can go a couple of days in a row probably without talking about the nuclear force, but everything that's happening in space, and the reason I think that Strategic Command was told that, or given the mission as space as a joint operating area, is because of everything that is going on in space and everything that both of y'all talked about. It complicates our life, certainly, from that perspective, in being able to determine whether or not somebody is launching something that is what it was intended to be, the number of things that it was intended to be, and behaving the way it was intending to behave. We don't want to be the traffic cop. I think everything that's going on is very exciting. We will continue to partner with NASA and working with them. And then NASA then in turns will work with the commercial sectors, just like we're doing right now with the Commercial Crew Program. It's a really exciting time. General Hyten is the right individual, I think, to take the reins of Strategic Command as being the foremost space expert in the military. And I think he would sit here and tell you that he's very excited about this and what's going to happen over the next few years, and looking forward to working with all of you in this endeavor.
Okay, great. I want to say thank you to all the panelists. Can we have a round of applause for your participation? Thank you.